Thick clouds hung over the horizon like smoke clinging to an open flame as the three friends pulled into the gravelly parking lot of Black Ridge State Park. The air was heavy with humidity, and the evening sun, already dipping behind the treetops, painted the world in gold and shadows. Danny cut the engine of his old Jeep, its sputter dying in the unsettling stillness. "Can't believe we're actually doing this," Lucy muttered, tightening her plaid shirt around her waist. Her voice wavered, but she forced a smile. She didn't want Danny or Eric to know how much she hated this idea. "Come on, it's just one night. We'll sit around the fire, tell some stories, and head back in the morning. Easy," Danny replied, slinging a pack over his shoulder. His grin was infectious, but there was always a challenge behind it, a dare you couldn't turn down. Eric, the quietest of the three, didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the tree line, where the dense forest seemed to whisper among itself. "You sure this is the right spot?" he asked finally. "GPS says so." Danny held up his phone, but the signal was already waning. Anyway, who needs tech? It's just us and nature now. The trail was overgrown, the dirt path barely visible through a carpet of moss and undergrowth. Their boots crunched on twigs and leaves, the sound oddly loud in the surrounding quiet. The further they walked, the darker it got, the sun abandoning them entirely. By the time they reached the designated campsite, they were bathed in shadow. "Cozy," Lucy said sarcastically, eyeing the clearing. A fire ring sat in the middle, its blackened stones a testament to previous campers. Beyond it, towering pines formed a fortress around the small patch of open ground. Danny dropped his pack and began setting up his tent. "You're gonna love it, Lou. Perfect setup for a scary story night." She rolled her eyes but started helping him. Eric, however, was frozen, staring at something just beyond the fire ring. "Eric?" Lucy called. He didn't answer at first, his face pale. "There's something out there." Danny laughed. "Dude, it's probably a deer or something. Relax." But as Eric finally broke his gaze and turned to face them, Lucy caught a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, something tall and dark slipping between the trees. Night fell quickly in Black Ridge State Park. The fire crackled weakly in the center of the clearing, its light barely penetrating the thick wall of trees. Lucy sat cross-legged on her sleeping bag, staring into the flames as Danny and Eric argued over the proper way to start a campfire. "I'm just saying," Danny insisted, poking at the embers with a stick. "You can't just dump lighter fluid on everything and call it a day." Eric shot him a look. "It worked, didn't it? Fire's going." "Barely," Lucy muttered under her breath. Their bickering was a familiar comfort, a reminder of how many nights they'd spent like this, though usually in someone's backyard instead of the middle of nowhere. But tonight felt different. The forest around them was too quiet, the air too heavy, pressing against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. "All right, time for the main event," Danny announced, pulling a flashlight from his pack. He flicked it on, casting a long beam of light across the clearing. "Scary stories. Who's first?" Lucy hesitated. She wasn't in the mood for ghost tales, not after what Eric had said earlier. "Maybe we should just—" "I've got one," Eric interrupted. His voice was low, almost reluctant, but there was a gravity to it that silenced the group. Danny leaned forward eagerly. "Lay it on us, man." Eric took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the fire. "My dad used to tell me the story about Black Ridge, said it was a warning, but I always thought he was just trying to scare me. Now, I'm not so sure." Lucy frowned. "What kind of warning?" "There's something in these woods," Eric began, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something that doesn't belong. My dad called it the Hollow Man. Said it wasn't really a man at all, but something pretending to be one. It wears faces like masks, mimics voices to lure people deeper into the forest. And once you're lost, it takes you." A shiver ran down Lucy's spine. She glanced at Danny, expecting him to laugh, but he was uncharacteristically quiet. "What happens to the people it takes?" she asked. "No one knows. They're just—" Eric's gaze shifted to the trees, his expression unreadable. "But my dad swore he saw it once. Said it followed him all the way home, standing just outside the light of his lantern. He never went camping again after that." The fire popped loudly, and Lucy jumped, her heart pounding. "Okay, great story," Danny said, trying to inject some levity into the moment. "But it's just that, a story." Eric didn't respond. His eyes were still on the forest, where shadows seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering firelight. A sudden snap of a branch echoed through the clearing. All three of them froze, their heads whipping toward the sound. "Probably just a deer," Danny said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Or the Hollow Man," Eric muttered. Lucy clenched her fists, willing her racing heart to slow. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush sent a jolt through the group. Lucy shot a panicked glance at Danny, who stood frozen, the flashlight beam trembling in his grip. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thundering of her heart. Danny nodded slowly. Yeah, I did." Eric's hand moved instinctively to the knife clipped to his belt. "It's too heavy to be a deer," he muttered, "and it's getting closer." The fire's light suddenly seemed insufficient, its small glow swallowed by the oppressive darkness beyond. Lucy felt a wave of dread wash over her as the footsteps stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. "Hello?" Danny called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" A long pause followed, the kind that stretched uncomfortably, making the seconds feel like minutes. Then a voice came from the darkness, a deep, gravelly tone that didn't sound entirely human. "Lost, help me." Lucy's stomach dropped. The words were slurred, almost garbled, as if whoever or whatever was speaking hadn't used their voice in a long time. Danny stepped forward cautiously, the flashlight beam cutting through the trees. "Who's there? Are you hurt?" "No," Eric hissed, grabbing Danny's arm. "Don't." "Why not?" Danny snapped, yanking his arm free. "It could be someone who needs help." Eric's face was pale, his voice low and urgent. "It's not. Trust me." Before Danny could argue, the voice came again, closer this time. "Please, I'm so cold." Lucy felt her legs tremble beneath her. "This isn't right," she whispered. "Something's wrong." Danny hesitated, glancing between Lucy and Eric. Then, against his better judgment, he stepped toward the sound, his flashlight sweeping the trees. "If you're out there, come into the light." A rustling came from the shadows, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was considering his invitation. The air grew colder, and Lucy shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. When the figure finally emerged, it stopped just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs seemed unnaturally long, its movements jerky and disjointed. Its face was a pale blur, indistinct and featureless, as if it had been smeared like wet paint. "Oh my God," Lucy breathed, backing away. Danny's grip on the flashlight tightened, his knuckles white. What is that?" The figure tilted its head, as if mimicking a human gesture, and stepped closer. The firelight illuminated its body, revealing clothing that looked tattered and wrong, like pieces of different people stitched together. Eric's voice was barely above a whisper. "The Hollow Man." The figure raised one impossibly long arm, its fingers curling unnaturally as it pointed at them. Its voice came again, but this time it was clearer, more familiar. Danny, Lucy, Eric. It was their names, spoken in their own voices. Lucy screamed, and the thing lunged forward, its movements impossibly fast. Danny dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as the group scrambled backward. "Run!" Eric shouted, shoving Lucy toward the trees. Her feet moved on instinct, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she plunged into the forest. Behind her, she could hear the others running too, their panicked footsteps echoing in the darkness. The thing's voice followed them, its tone mocking. "You can't hide. I'll find you." The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and shifting as if alive. No matter how fast she ran, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind her. Its cold breath on her neck. And then she tripped, the ground rushing up to meet her. Lucy hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of her lungs. Dirt and leaves clung to her palms as she scrambled to her feet, her ears straining for the sound of pursuit. The forest around her was impossibly dark, the firelight long gone. "Danik?" She called out, her voice hoarse. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence of the woods. Her chest heaved as she fought to calm her breathing, but every second that passed made her panic grow. She had to keep moving. Lucy's feet pounded against the uneven ground as she ran deeper into the forest, her pulse thundering in her ears. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from that thing. The Hollow Man. A faint cry broke through the darkness. "Lucy!" It was Danny's voice, Relief flooded her, and she turned toward the sound. "Danny, I'm here." The voice came again, closer now. "Over here." But something about it was wrong, too flat, too perfect, as if it had been recorded and played back. Lucy hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run the other way. "Don't," a voice whispered near her ear, and she nearly screamed. It was Eric. He appeared from the shadows, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "It's not him, it's trying to lure you." Lucy's eyes widened. "How do you know?" "I just do," Eric said firmly, pulling her into the cover of a massive tree trunk. "We have to stick together. That's the only way we'll make it out." A low, guttural growl echoed through the woods, sending chills down Lucy's spine. The hollow man was still hunting them. Eric grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. "Come on, there's an old ranger's cabin near here. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." The two of them moved as quickly as they could, their footsteps muffled by the forest floor. Lucy's mind raced, her fear battling with a desperate hope. A cabin meant shelter, maybe even a radio to call for help. But as they neared a clearing, Lucy stopped short. The cabin was there, just as Eric had said, but it looked abandoned, its windows shattered and its door hanging off its hinges. "This is it?" she asked, her voice shaking. Eric nodded. "Better than nothing. Let's go." They stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath their weight. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Lucy's flashlight flickered as she swept it across the room, revealing broken furniture and graffiti scrawled on the walls. "Block the door," Eric said, dragging a heavy table toward the entrance. Lucy helped him, her hands trembling. "Do you think it'll hold?" "It has to," Eric said grimly. A loud thud against the door made them both jump. Something was out there, scratching and clawing, its guttural growls growing louder. "It's here," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible. The thing slammed against the door again, harder this time, the wood splintering under the force. Lucy backed away, her heart racing as she gripped Eric's arm. "What do we do?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. Eric's eyes darted around the room, landing on a rusted axe leaning against the far wall. He grabbed it and turned to Lucy. "If it gets in, we fight." The next slam broke the door off its hinges, sending the table crashing to the ground. The hollow man stepped into the cabin, its twisted form illuminated by the flashlight's flickering beam. It moved toward them, its head tilting unnaturally as it spoke in their voices. "Danny, Lucy, Eric, you can't escape." Eric raised the axe, his hands shaking. "Stay back!" The creature lunged, and chaos erupted. Lucy screamed as Eric swung the axe, the blade biting into the hollow man's arm. The thing let out a shriek, a sound that seemed to pierce her very soul. "Keep going," Eric shouted, but the hollow man was fast, its long limbs swiping at him with terrifying strength. Lucy grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor and drove it into the creature's side. It howled, its form flickering like a broken projection. For a moment it seemed to falter, its limbs spasming as it staggered backward. Eric seized the opportunity, swinging the axe again and again until the thing crumpled to the ground. Breathing heavily, they stared at the motionless form. "Is it dead?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Eric said, dropping the axe. "But we can't stay here. We need to find Danny and get out of these woods." As they stepped outside, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The hollow man's body was gone, leaving only a faint, acrid smell in the air. Lucy looked at Eric, her face pale but determined. "Let's go, before it comes back." Together, they disappeared into the trees, the rising sun their only guide. The gravel crunched beneath the old van's tires as it veered off the main road and onto a narrow, unmarked path. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the towering trees seemed to close in, swallowing the last traces of civilization. Four friends, Alex, Zoe, Marcus, and Clara, were heading into the heart of Black Hollow Forest, a sprawling expanse of untamed wilderness with a reputation for being, as locals warned, unforgiving. But to Alex, the de facto leader of their group, the promise of an untouched campsite far outweighed any ominous rumors. "This is it," Alex said, cutting the engine and stepping out into the hushed stillness. His enthusiasm was palpable, his green eyes alight with the thrill of adventure. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" Clara asked, glancing at the wrinkled map they'd printed from an outdated website. Her voice betrayed unease, though she tried to mask it with curiosity. Zoe shrugged, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Right spot or not, it's perfect for getting away from everything. No cell service, no work emails, no nosy neighbors. She shot a glance at Marcus, who was already unloading their gear, his broad shoulders flexing as he lugged a heavy cooler. Yeah, no neighbors, Marcus quipped, but also no help if we get into trouble. Don't jinx it, Alex said with a grin. He was the eternal optimist, the kind who dismissed danger as an afterthought. The campsite was idyllic, or so it seemed at first glance. A clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a shallow stream cutting through the edge. They pitched their tents and set up a fire pit, the sun dipping low on the horizon. The golden light turned the forest into a mosaic of shadows, the trees creaking faintly in the breeze. As night fell, they gathered around the crackling fire. Alex handed out marshmallows, while Zoe rummaged for ghost stories on her phone, though the lack of reception left her with only downloaded ones to read aloud. How about this one? She said, her voice rising theatrically. A hiker vanishes without a trace in Black Hollow Forest, his campsite found with strange symbols carved into the trees. Marcus groaned. Come on, Zoe, we're already out here in the middle of nowhere. Do we really need the campfire horror stories? That's the whole point, she shot back, grinning. Clara stayed quiet, her eyes darting to the trees as if she expected something or someone to step out. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual symphony of crickets and distant owls replaced by an oppressive silence. You okay? Alex asked, nudging her shoulder gently. Yeah, she lied. I just thought I heard something earlier, probably an animal. Nothing bigger than a raccoon out here, Alex assured her. But as the hours wore on and the fire died to embers, even Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The quiet wasn't just unnatural, it was wrong. And when Marcus suddenly stood, his face pale, and muttered, "Did you guys hear that?" They all froze. A faint sound drifted through the trees, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down their spines. Probably a coyote, Alex said, though his voice lacked conviction. That didn't sound like a coyote, Clara whispered. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of snapping branches. Maybe we should head into the tents, Zoe suggested, her usual bravado giving way to unease. But none of them moved, their gazes fixed on the dark line of trees. Whatever was out there, it was watching. The growling ceased, leaving the four campers in a deafening silence, broken only by their own rapid breathing. Alex clenched the flashlight tighter, sweeping its narrow beam across the line of trees. Shadows danced and warped, giving fleeting impressions of movement, but nothing solid emerged. It's probably just a deer or something, Alex said, his voice straining to sound convincing. That didn't sound like any deer I've ever heard, Marcus muttered, his fists balled as he stood protectively in front of Clara. I'm not staying out here. Zoe's voice was tight as she scrambled to her feet. I'm going to the tent. Whatever's out there, it's not worth messing around for. She stomped off toward the tents, her phone flashlight bobbing in the dark. The others exchanged uneasy glances before following. As they zipped themselves into their tents, the world outside seemed to shrink, the thin nylon fabric doing little to ward off the night's looming presence. The hours dragged. Clara lay awake, listening to the rhythmic breaths of the others. At least, she thought they were breaths, until she realized the faint rustling outside didn't match the cadence of her friend's slumber. "Alex?" she whispered. No response. Heart pounding, she reached for her flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam revealed nothing unusual, just the campfire's smoldering embers and the dark wall of trees. She let out a shaky breath, about to retreat, when she saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, and unnervingly still. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. The flashlight's beam barely illuminated its pale, gaunt face, but she could see its hollow eyes that seemed to fix on her with an intelligence that felt profoundly wrong. "Alex!" she hissed louder this time. The figure moved, not toward her, but around the clearing's edge, its movements jerky, almost insect-like. Clara scrambled backward, waking Marcus with a start. "What the?" he began, but Clara clamped a hand over his mouth. "Shh, there's something out there," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus grabbed the flashlight and looked out, his expression hardening. There's nothing. But then he saw it too. The figure stopped, its head tilting unnaturally as if it were listening. Marcus cursed under his breath and ducked back into the tent, zipping it up tight. "What do we do?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "We wait until morning," Marcus said grimly. "We don't go outside." Morning couldn't come fast enough. Every noise outside, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves kept them wide awake, hearts pounding. By the time the sun rose, none of them had slept. The light of day brought a fleeting sense of relief, but the unease lingered like a shadow. They emerged from their tents cautiously, their eyes scanning the clearing for any sign of the figure. "It's gone," Alex said, though the words felt hollow. "Did you see it?" Marcus asked. Alex shook his head, but Clara spoke up. "I did. It wasn't human." Rubbing her arms against the morning chill, glanced toward the trees. Whatever it was, it left tracks. Sure enough, the ground near the edge of the clearing bore strange impressions, deep, clawed footprints that didn't match any animal they knew. "This isn't normal," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to pack up and leave," Zoe said firmly. Alex hesitated. "We came all this way. Maybe we scared it off. It might not come back." But as he spoke, Marcus bent down to examine the tracks more closely. "These aren't fresh," he said slowly. "They're overlapping. Whatever it was, it's been circling us all night." The realization hit them all at once, and the fragile sense of safety they'd clung to shattered. The decision to leave was unanimous. The strange tracks, Clara's sighting, and the oppressive sense of being watched had eroded any excitement they'd once felt about their trip. They hastily packed up their tents, shoving gear into their bags with shaking hands. "We'll stick to the path we came in on," Alex said, trying to sound authoritative. "If we leave now, we'll be back to the van by midday." Clara stayed close to Marcus, her eyes darting to the trees as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. Zoe, usually so composed, muttered nervously under her breath. Only Alex seemed determined to maintain an air of calm, though the tight set of his jaw betrayed his nerves. The group began their trek back, the narrow path winding through dense forest. The further they walked, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as though the forest itself were pressing in on them. Even the sunlight filtering through the canopy above seemed dim and weak, offering little comfort. About an hour in, the sound began. At first, it was subtle, barely perceptible over the crunch of leaves beneath their boots, a faint, rhythmic clicking that seemed to echo through the trees. "Do you hear that?" Zoe asked, her voice trembling. Alex stopped, his head tilting as he strained to listen. "It's probably just branches knocking together in the wind." "There's no wind," Clara pointed out, her voice tight. The clicking grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. It was deliberate, like the ticking of some giant, unseen clock. "We need to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice low. They quickened their pace, but the sound followed, its source unseen. The clicking was joined by another noise, soft, almost imperceptible whispers. "It's just the wind," Alex said again, though no one believed him. Then the path disappeared. One moment, they were following the narrow trail, and the next, it simply ended, swallowed by the forest. Alex spun in a slow circle, confusion etched on his face. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "We stayed on the path." "No, we didn't," Zoe snapped. "We've been walking in circles. Look." She pointed to a nearby tree, its bark scarred with deep, claw-like gouges. Clara's stomach dropped. She recognized the marks, they matched the ones near their campsite. "We can't be back here," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've been walking for over an hour." "But we are," Clara said, her voice shaking. It's like the forest won't let us leave." Panic set in. Zoe cursed under her breath, pacing back and forth while Alex studied the map, which now seemed like a cruel joke. Marcus stood guard, scanning the trees with narrowed eyes. "We need to stay calm," Alex said, though his hands trembled as he folded the useless map. "We'll backtrack. Find where we went wrong." But as they turned to retrace their steps, the forest around them seemed to shift. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches interlocking overhead like a cage. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though the words were unintelligible. Clara grabbed Alex's arm. "This isn't normal. This place, it's alive. It's messing with us." "I don't believe that," Alex said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You don't have to believe it," Zoe snapped. "Just look around. It's like the forest is changing." Then came the scream. It was distant but blood-curdling, echoing through the trees and sending a chill down their spines. It was impossible to tell where it had come from, but it was enough to send them into a sprint. They ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The forest seemed endless, the trees a blur as the whispers rose to a deafening cacophony. Finally, they stumbled into another clearing. But instead of relief, dread filled their hearts. It was their campsite. The fire pit was cold, their gear strewn about as if they'd never packed it. But what caught their attention were the symbols carved into the trees, arranged in a perfect circle around the clearing. The same symbols Zoe had read about in her campfire story. The group stood frozen, staring at the ominous carvings encircling their campsite. Each symbol was intricate, otherworldly, and deeply unsettling. They seemed to writhe and twist when viewed too long, as if alive. "This isn't possible," Zoe whispered, her voice shaking. "We packed everything. We left." "It's not us," Clara said, her words trembling. "Something brought us back here." "No," Alex snapped, his face pale but defiant. "We made a mistake. We got turned around. That's all." Marcus stepped forward, inspecting one of the symbols carved into a tree. "This isn't just some prank," he muttered. "These markings, they're old, deep, like they've been here for years." As he traced the grooves with his finger, a sudden, guttural cry erupted from the forest, closer this time. It was louder than before, vibrating through the clearing and chilling them to the bone. "We have to leave, now," Zoe said, her voice cracking. "We can't," Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't you get it? It won't let us leave." The whispers returned, this time accompanied by faint, disjointed laughter that seemed to echo from all directions. It was a sound that didn't belong, a sound that turned the blood in their veins to ice. Alex tried to rally them. "We'll move together, no splitting up. If we stay calm, we'll find our way back to the van." But as he spoke, the trees at the edge of the clearing shifted again, their branches bending and twisting unnaturally. The gaps between the trunks seemed to narrow, closing them in. "Look," Clara cried, pointing toward the center of the clearing. The fire pit had been disturbed. Where cold ashes had once sat, a crude effigy now stood, a humanoid figure constructed from sticks, bones, and scraps of fabric. It was grotesque, its empty eye sockets somehow staring directly at them. "Nope. Nope, nope, nope." Zoe backed away, shaking her head furiously. "We didn't make that," Marcus said grimly, his voice barely audible. A sudden gust of wind blew through the clearing, extinguishing the faint sunlight and plunging them into an eerie twilight. The laughter grew louder, more mocking, as if whatever was toying with them was growing bolder. "Run!" Alex yelled. They bolted, crashing through the underbrush without direction or plan. Branches clawed at their skin, and the whispers followed them, growing louder, almost taunting. The forest seemed alive, the trees reaching out like skeletal hands, forcing them to zigzag wildly. Clara tripped, falling hard onto the forest floor. Marcus stopped to help her up, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "We can't stop," he panted. "What's the point?" Clara sobbed. "It's everywhere. It's not letting us leave." Marcus pulled her up, his jaw set. "Then we fight it. Whatever it is, we fight." The group stumbled into another clearing, but this one was different. It was smaller, more confined, with a single towering tree at its center. Its bark was blackened and twisted, its roots sprawling like veins over the ground. Strange symbols were carved into its trunk, glowing faintly in the dim light. "We're not supposed to be here," Zoe whispered, clutching her sides as she gasped for air. The air grew heavier, thick with the stench of decay. From the shadows, the figure Clara had seen the night before emerged, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was closer now, and there was no mistaking its inhumanity. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through each of them, as though it could see their very souls. Alex stepped forward, gripping the knife he'd pulled from his bag. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice betrayed his fear. The figure stopped, tilting its head further, almost curiously. Then it raised one spindly arm and pointed toward the tree. "What does it want?" Clara whispered, clutching Marcus's arm. "I don't care," Zoe hissed. "We're not sticking around to find out." But as they turned to run, the forest closed in around them, the trees moving impossibly fast to form an impenetrable wall. They were trapped. The figure moved closer, and Alex lunged at it with the knife. The blade sank into its chest, but the creature didn't react. Instead, it gripped Alex's arm with unnatural strength, its bony fingers curling tightly. Alex screamed as the knife fell from his hand. "No!" Clara yelled, rushing forward. But Marcus held her back. "It's too late," he shouted. The creature released Alex, who crumpled to the ground, unmoving. The others backed away, trembling. The creature turned its hollow gaze to the rest of them and pointed again at the tree. This time, they understood. It was commanding them. "We don't have a choice," Marcus said grimly. With shaking hands, they approached the tree. As they drew closer, the symbols on its bark glowed brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. The whispers reached a crescendo, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. When Clara touched the tree, a blinding light engulfed them, and everything went silent. When they awoke, they were back at the edge of the forest. The van parked exactly where they'd left it. But something was wrong. Alex was gone, and their memories of what had happened after touching the tree were a haze. As they drove away in stunned silence, Clara glanced back at the forest, now bathed in the golden light of day. For a moment, she thought she saw the figure standing among the trees watching, and then it was gone. The stars shimmered cold and distant above the thick canopy of pine trees as Mia tightened her jacket against the creeping chill. She glanced back at the group of friends trailing behind her. Ben, the ever-optimistic planner. Liz, her best friend with a knack for sarcasm. And Alex, who seemed more interested in his phone than the promise of a night disconnected from civilization. They'd been hiking for hours, their boots crunching against the brittle forest floor, and Mia couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched. "Are you sure this is the right trail?" Alex's voice broke the uneasy silence. He stopped mid-stride, frowning as his phone screen flashed, "No signal." Ben chuckled, pulling out a weathered map. "Relax, man. GPS is for amateurs. The map says we're close to the campsite." Liz rolled her eyes. "The map also said this hike would take 2 hours, and we're pushing 4. What's your definition of close, Ben?" "Trust me," Ben replied, a grin plastered across his face that did little to reassure anyone. As they trudged onward, the forest seemed to close in, the towering trees blotting out what little moonlight remained. The temperature dropped, carrying with it an eerie stillness that made Mia's skin crawl. She thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, something small and quick darting between the trunks. But when she turned, there was nothing but darkness. "Did anyone else see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Liz said, her tone dismissive, though she scanned the trees warily. Mia hesitated, unsure if she'd imagined it. "Probably nothing," she muttered, though her fingers gripped the straps of her backpack tightly. Finally, they arrived at the clearing Ben had promised. A fire pit stood at its center, surrounded by old moss-covered logs arranged like benches. The sight should have been comforting, but something about it felt wrong. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Even the crickets seemed to have gone quiet. "This place is perfect," Ben announced, throwing down his pack. He busied himself gathering firewood while the others set up their tents. Mia worked quickly, her movements mechanical, her mind replaying the flicker of motion she'd seen earlier. By the time the fire was lit, its warm glow illuminating their small circle, Mia had convinced herself she was just being paranoid. They laughed, swapping stories as the flames crackled, but the laughter felt forced. She noticed Alex sitting stiffly, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "What's wrong?" she asked him quietly. He shook his head. "It's nothing. Just thought I heard." His voice trailed off, and he forced a grin. "Probably an animal." "Or a ghost," Liz teased, her smirk cutting through the tension. "Come on, Alex. Don't tell me you're scared." But as the night deepened, Alex's unease spread to the others. The firewood cracked and hissed, casting long, dancing shadows. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves became a potential threat. Mia tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to her like the cold air. When they finally turned in for the night, Mia lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling of her tent. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the trees, and she could have sworn she heard whispering, a low, indecipherable murmur that sent shivers down her spine. She turned to Liz, who was already asleep, her breathing steady. Mia squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to sleep. But just as she was drifting off, she heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, faint and rasping, coming from the forest. "You shouldn't have come." Mia sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. She strained to hear, but the voice was gone. Instead, there was the soft crunch of footsteps just outside the tent. Mia held her breath, every muscle in her body taut as the crunching footsteps circled the tent. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, taking care not to be noticed. She glanced at Liz, who remained sound asleep, oblivious to the growing tension. For a moment, Mia thought about waking her, but something about the deliberate pacing outside made her hesitate. Then the footsteps stopped. Mia's heart hammered in her chest. The silence was unbearable, thick and suffocating. Just as she was about to convince herself it was her imagination, the tent zipper moved. Not much, just a tiny tug, but enough to send her scrambling for her flashlight. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the switch, and when the beam of light finally illuminated the tent, there was nothing there. "Liz?" Mia hissed, shaking her friend's shoulder. Liz groaned, groggy and annoyed. "What is it?" Liz mumbled, pulling the sleeping bag over her head. "Someone's outside," Mia whispered, her voice cracking. Liz sat up, her expression shifting from irritation to concern. "Are you sure? Could it be Ben or Alex?" "I don't think so," Mia replied, glancing nervously at the tent flap. It didn't sound like them. Before Liz could respond, they heard a loud crash, a metallic clang, followed by the unmistakable sound of Ben shouting. Both girls bolted from the tent, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. In the dim glow of the firelight, they saw Ben standing near the fire pit, holding a large stick like a weapon. Alex was next to him, pale and wide-eyed. "What happened?" Liz asked, her voice sharp with panic. "Someone was out here," Ben said, his voice trembling despite his bravado. "They knocked over the gear." Mia's flashlight swept across the campsite, landing on their scattered backpacks and overturned cooking supplies. "Did you see them?" she asked. "No," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they were close. I could feel them." Liz scoffed, though her usual sarcasm was muted by unease. "Probably some drunk hiker messing with us." "Drunk hikers don't whisper creepy warnings," Mia muttered, earning a sharp look from Liz. "What whisper?" Ben asked, stepping closer. Mia hesitated, realizing how ridiculous it would sound. I thought I heard someone say, 'You shouldn't have come.'" Alex's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. "You heard it too?" The group fell silent, the weight of Alex's confirmation pressing down on them. Ben shook his head, muttering something about paranoia, but his grip on the stick tightened. "Let's just pack up and leave," Alex said. "I'm not staying here." "It's the middle of the night," Ben argued. "We'd get lost trying to hike back in the dark." Liz crossed her arms. "So what? We stay here and hope the ghost of campfire's past leaves us alone?" "Everyone calm down," Ben said, though his own fear was evident. "We'll keep watch in shifts. If anyone or anything comes back, we'll be ready." Reluctantly, they agreed. Ben took the first watch, sitting by the fire with his makeshift weapon while the others retreated to their tents. Mia tried to sleep, but every creak of the trees and whisper of the wind set her nerves on edge. When her turn came, she sat by the dwindling fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the trees. Hours passed, and just when she thought the night might end uneventfully, she saw him. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. His clothes were tattered, his face obscured by the darkness. He didn't move or speak, just stared at her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. "Ben!" Mia hissed, backing toward the tents. "Someone's out there." Ben rushed out, followed by the others, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustling of leaves, just an empty void where he had been. "Are you sure you saw someone?" Liz asked, though her voice lacked its usual skepticism. "I'm not crazy," Mia snapped. "He was right there." They stood in tense silence, the fire crackling between them. Then, faintly, from deep within the woods, came a sound that chilled them to the bone, a slow, rhythmic tapping, like wood knocking against wood. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to echo all around them. "We need to leave," Alex said, his voice trembling. For once, no one argued. The group scrambled to gather their belongings, their breaths visible in the cold night air as panic set in. The tapping continued, echoing eerily from different directions, as if the forest itself were alive and mocking them. Mia's hands shook as she stuffed her sleeping bag into her backpack, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the image of the man standing at the edge of the clearing. His hollow presence burned into her memory. "Leave it." Ben snapped when Alex fumbled with the overturned cooking supplies. "We don't need it, just grab the essentials and go." Liz, for once, was silent as she worked quickly to collapse her tent. Her usual sharp remarks were replaced by a haunted look, her eyes darting toward the surrounding trees. "What if it's not a person?" she muttered, almost to herself. "What does that even mean?" Ben barked, his voice rising as the tapping grew louder. "It means we're screwed," Alex interjected, his voice trembling. "This place isn't normal. We should have never come here." Mia zipped her pack and slung it over her shoulder. "We need to stick together. No one wanders off, no matter what happens." Her voice was steadier than she felt, but it seemed to anchor the group, if only slightly. The tapping abruptly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The group froze, their breaths coming in short gasps. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods came a low, guttural moan. It wasn't an animal, it was something else, something that didn't belong. "Move," Mia shouted, breaking the spell. They plunged into the darkness, their flashlights flickering as they navigated the uneven terrain. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. Every step seemed to echo, the crunch of leaves and twigs deafening in the absence of other sounds. They hadn't gone far when Alex stopped abruptly. "Wait," he whispered, pointing his flashlight at a nearby tree. The beam revealed a strange marking carved into the bark, a series of crude, intersecting lines forming a spiral pattern. The edges were fresh, the sap still oozing, glistening in the light. "What is that?" Liz asked, her voice barely audible. "I've seen this before," Alex said, his face pale. "My uncle told me about symbols like these. He said they were warnings, markers to keep people out of sacred or cursed places." "Cursed places?" Ben scoffed, but his bravado was hollow. "You seriously think this is some kind of voodoo or whatever? Do you have a better explanation?" Alex snapped, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Mia's eyes scanned the surrounding trees, and her stomach dropped. "There's more." The light revealed dozens of similar carvings on the trees around them, spiraling patterns that seemed to close in, forming a boundary. The air grew colder, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent that made Mia's head swim. "We need to get out of here. Now," she said, her voice firm. As they pressed forward, the forest seemed to resist their progress. The undergrowth thickened, thorny vines snagging at their clothes and backpacks. The sense of being watched intensified, and Mia felt the weight of unseen eyes on her. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was this a trap? A warning? Or something worse? Then they found the cabin. It appeared suddenly, as if conjured by the oppressive woods. A small, decrepit structure with rotting wooden walls and a sagging roof. The windows were broken, and the door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. "No way," Liz said, shaking her head. "We're not going in there." "We don't have a choice," Mia replied. The tapping had resumed, louder and closer, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to swirl around them. Ben stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the cabin's shadowed interior. "It's shelter. At least we can barricade ourselves in." "From what?" Alex asked, but no one answered. Reluctantly, they entered. The inside was as bleak as the outside, dusty, cluttered with broken furniture and scattered debris. Strange symbols were scratched into the walls, similar to the ones on the trees. A faint, acrid smell lingered in the air. As they worked to secure the door, a loud thud came from the back of the cabin. Everyone froze. "Did anyone check the other rooms?" Mia whispered. Ben shook his head, gripping his stick tightly. "Stay here. I'll look." "No," Mia said, stepping forward. "We'll go together." They moved cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The back room was small, empty, save for a single chair in the center. On it sat an object that made Mia's blood run cold. A carved wooden mask, its features twisted into a grotesque, grinning face. The tapping was now just outside. The tapping surrounded the cabin, a maddening rhythm that seemed to grow louder with every heartbeat. Mia stared at the grotesque wooden mask on the chair, its malevolent grin frozen in place. It was crudely made, yet disturbingly lifelike, as if it were watching her. A faint chill radiated from it, making her shudder. "Don't touch it," Alex whispered, as though reading her thoughts. "No one's touching anything," Ben replied firmly, his knuckles white as he gripped the stick. "We just need to wait this out." "Wait what out?" Liz snapped, her voice breaking. "Whatever's out there isn't just going to leave." Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was worse than the noise, oppressive and absolute. Then came a new sound, a slow, deliberate creak like footsteps on rotting wood. They weren't coming from outside. "They're in here," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Ben took a step forward, his flashlight sweeping across the room. It landed on the mask again, but something was different. The chair was empty. "Where?" Liz began, but a loud crash from the front of the cabin cut her off. The door they had so carefully barricaded now hung open, the wood splintered as if from a powerful force. "No," Alex whispered, backing away. "This isn't happening." "We need to leave," Mia said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Now." Ben hesitated, his eyes darting between the shattered door and the shadowy forest beyond. "If we run, we'll be sitting ducks. And if we stay, we'll die here." Liz shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not waiting around to see what's out there." Mia grabbed Liz's arm, pulling her toward the door. "Stick together. Don't stop for anything." They burst out of the cabin into the cold night, their flashlights barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The forest felt alive, the trees closing in as they ran. The symbols carved into the trunks seemed to glow faintly, their spirals pulling Mia's gaze like a magnet. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the ground ahead. Behind her, Alex screamed. She turned just in time to see him disappear, his flashlight tumbling to the ground. The beam spun wildly, illuminating claw-like shadows that writhed and twisted before vanishing into the darkness. "Alex!" Ben shouted, but Mia grabbed his arm. "We can't stop," she yelled. "We have to keep moving." Liz was ahead of them, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Where are we going?" she cried. "We're going in circles." Mia wanted to argue, to deny it, but she knew Liz was right. The same twisted trees loomed on all sides, the same faintly glowing symbols mocking them. It was as if the forest itself were shifting, trapping them in a labyrinth they couldn't escape. Then up ahead they saw it, a faint light, flickering like a beacon. It wasn't the warm glow of a campfire, but something colder, paler. Mia's gut told her to turn back, but Liz was already running toward it. "Liz, wait!" Mia called, but Liz didn't slow down. As they approached the light, the forest seemed to thin, the trees giving way to another clearing. In the center stood the man Mia had seen earlier, his tattered clothes illuminated by the ghostly glow. He held the wooden mask in one hand, his face obscured by shadows. Liz stopped abruptly, her flashlight falling to the ground. What do you want?" she stammered. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised the mask, placing it over his face. The glow intensified, and the air grew heavy, thick with the metallic scent that had haunted them all night. "Run!" Mia screamed, but it was too late. The man stepped forward, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift, pulling them toward the clearing. Liz was the first to fall, her screams cutting off abruptly as she vanished into the earth. Ben grabbed Mia's arm, his face pale with terror. "We have to jump," he shouted, but his words were drowned out by a deafening roar, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something ancient and otherworldly. Mia felt herself being dragged, the force irresistible. She clawed at the ground, her fingers scraping against the dirt, but it was no use. The last thing she saw was the man's mask, grinning down at her as the darkness swallowed her whole. When Mia awoke, she was alone. The forest was silent, the air still. Her flashlight lay beside her, the beam weak but steady. She sat up, her body aching, and looked around. There was no sign of Ben, Liz, or Alex, no symbols on the trees, no cabin. But in the distance, she heard it, the faint tapping growing louder.